Welcome back to the Plan Your Federal Retirement Podcast. I'm your co-host, Micah, and I'm super excited to be here today because we have a special guest. I'm excited to talk about that. So welcome, Joe Curry. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
I am happy to be here and excited to chat.
Yeah, well, if you couldn't notice a little bit by the accent, Joe is from Canada, and we actually met several years ago, and he does a fantastic job in financial planning as a whole, which I really love, looking at that big picture of things, but specializing with retirees. And while Joe does not work with U.S. federal employees at all, Joe, I got a decent amount of clients that talk to me about either have Canadian retirement accounts and that, and they're like, what do I do with this money? Or I have a lot of clients that are like, well, some clients that say, when I retire, I want to move back to Canada.
Yeah, it's something that, I know friends and family who have, left Canada to live in the States, take up careers and jobs working down south. So it's something that I'm running into, and I'm sure that those people have to find an advisor, or they should be finding an advisor south of the border. In your case, I guess northwest, but anyway. So yeah, it's not surprising to me that you're running into those situations.
Yeah, so this is going to be a unique podcast. If it doesn't pertain to you, it might be interesting just sticking around, just kind of hear some differences that are out there. But if you are the few that this might apply, you're going to probably pick up some great information. So make sure you stay tuned to the podcast. And the end of it, we're going to share about some more information about Joe, where you can find his great information, and of course, our action items. So Joe, let me hit you with a couple of questions that kind of come up. Is that all right?
Sounds good.
So I know on my side, at least, is I'll have clients that will come to me. Again, they're federal employees, and then the spouse or them maybe just lived in Canada, they're a Canadian resident, but then they moved to the United States, and they have these Canadian retirement accounts that are there. And so they're like, Micah, what do I do with these accounts? And I kind of look at them and be like, it looks like an IRA, but it's not exactly like what I'm thinking an IRA is. So would you walk us through a little bit, like, what are those Canadian retirement accounts? And then we can kind of step into that next step, which is, what do clients do about them if they're still in the U.S.?
Sure, yeah. So it's, there's a lot of similarities to the accounts that you guys have for retirement accounts in the US. But so the RRSP, or Registered Retirement Savings Plan, is the most common account that we'd run into. And this is basically someone puts their savings into they're pre-funding their retirement. They get a deduction off of their income. So, if they have $100,000 of income, they put $20,000 into their RRSP. They're only paying tax for the year on $80,000. It's growing tax deferred, and the idea is eventually they'll turn around and use that account to withdraw from in retirement to supplement retirement spending. So just like some of the accounts you guys have, there's a certain point where, and you guys would call it an RMD, but basically we call it the RIF minimum, because those RRSPs have to transfer into a different type of account called a RIF, or a Registered Retirement Income Fund. As far as everything happening inside of the account, it's all the same, except it's designed to create an income stream of withdrawals. And at age 71, any RSP money has to go in there. It can happen earlier, but it has to go there by age 71. And by age 72, that minimum income requirement kicks in. So there's a couple other variations of this account, which would typically be, and this actually might be pretty common for what you're dealing with, Micah, is someone who had maybe some pension money, and then they ended up leaving. So that pension money might get rolled into what we call a locked-in retirement account. As far as the rules around how they work, so it's tax deferred growth in there. And again, it has to be flipped over by age 71, same rules. And there's the minimum income. The only difference on that account is there's actually a minimum that has to come out, but there's also a maximum. And so I think that's just so Canadian government's way of trying to make sure that pension money is not all used at once, and it's spread out over retirement.
So that kind of transfers the reliability from the employer on the pension side. Is this only a government pension, or can private companies create these pensions?
No, this is a private. Well? It could be either or.
Okay, so a private company that you work for in Canada, and it had this pension account, and then you leave service and you transition to America, when I get a job, get married, whatever those fun things are, and then this account, instead of it being on their books as an employer account, they move this into a version of an IRA account, but it's a little bit more locked up, where there's a minimum and a maximum that you can withdraw. Is there an age requirement on that one as well, Joe, that you can't touch it before a certain age without a penalty? Because there's at 72, you have to start taking money out, but what about before that?
Yeah, so you can't start taking any income out of there till age 55, right? So you basically, unless there's some special circumstances, like some financial instability, like bankruptcy or some other things going on like that,
Financial
or
hardship, I think is what we would call
yeah,
it.
that's
Something
the
like
word
that.
I'm looking for. Thank you.
Yeah.
Or some life expectancy, issues around that. Like,
Terminally
so there's
ill.
a couple of ways that you might end up getting access to that money, but for most people, it's going to be, you're not going to touch it until at least 55. You have to
Okay.
start it by 71.
Okay.
And then there's the minimum, the maximum once you start taking it. So there's also, this is probably getting beyond where you guys would be looking at it, but there's a way after 55 where you can get 50% of it unlocked into an RRSP. So
Okay.
there's some nuances around that, but for the most part, again, for purposes of when you're going to take the income, it's going to work the same as an RSP.
So it's very similar to the United States. When we say something's locked up, we mean, most of the time, but there's reasons why it could not be locked up, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Fair enough. Okay. So we got this age range then between 55 and 72, and we have to start taking money out. It doesn't matter which account, somewhere in there, we have to start taking money out of this account, RMD level, whatever the government's going to calculate for us. Is that fair?
Right. You got it.
When it moves into this RRSP to this RRIF, this RIF account that's there for the income fund, do your investments have to change with that? Or is the only difference you're just taking money out?
No, the only difference is you can't put money in, you have to take money out.
Gotcha. So there's no, when you say you cannot put money in, does that mean you cannot aggregate retirement accounts or you cannot make a contribution? Sorry to split hairs on you.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So if you had some additional accounts with the same, other locked in accounts, you can move them in together. Like you could combine them in most scenarios.
Gotcha.
Or so maybe you had the locked in retirement account, and then there was some other pension. And again, this is probably not going to be applicable for somebody who left the country, but someone who was still in Canada and they took another job and they had the same situation where they were going to move that money out of the pension again, they could generally combine it as long as it's the same province or it's federal or provincial. Like there's some different regulations around that. So, if you have an Ontario locked-in retirement account, but you also had a federal pension, like you wouldn't be able to combine those if you took the money out of the federal pension, if that was an option, right?
Yeah, so you have some like kind accounts. So whatever those like kinds are, you could kind of merge together. So in our worlds, it'd be like 401k accounts are kind of like kinds. We could merge those things together. But defined pension plans, assuming we're getting an income from them on the U.S. side, we cannot merge those with other accounts.
Yeah, yeah. And then as far as adding new money, as in contributions out of your bank account, you can't add anything once it's gone over to the RIF.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. That's really good to know. So now we have a client, let's just say hypothetical, not too hypothetical, because the clients that I was actually asking for your help on kind of how this all started is got a client that has, a couple $100,000 in an RRSP. They've been working in the United States for now, 30 plus years. They may want to retire back to Canada. They may not want to retire back to Canada, but they're not quite happy with the RRSP, with who someone's over there who's working on it. I don't really feel that I can just rip the money out and just bring it over to the U.S. and move it into an IRA account. I don't think it works that way. But walk me through kind of what those rules are.
Sure, yeah. So a couple things. So if you have the locked-in retirement account, even if you really wanted to, you can't take the money out as we discussed.
Right.
So that wouldn't even be an option. Now the RRSP, technically the client could take the money out, but there's going to be tax consequences because that's going to, any amount coming out of that account is going to go into income for the client, right? And so, when you're like the scenario you just highlighted, probably in peak earning years, it's probably not the ideal time to be taking a couple $100,000 of additional income.
Right.
So it's probably not an option. You can't really take it into an IRA account. Like that's not an option to take it across the border. So basically you're stuck until you want to start to take income or to pull the money out of the account. You're stuck with it in Canada. And there's not a lot of options of what you can do with it. So again, you left the country, you still have this, we call it these retirement accounts or registered investments. So maybe you have it with another advisor. So in that case, that advisor can continue to hold those accounts for you. They're actually not supposed to be soliciting any advice at that point. At that point, it almost becomes a self-directed account where you as the client need to go back to the advisor and give them direction on what you want to do.
Well, hold on a second. I was just going to make sure I'm understanding this real quick, Joe. So what I just heard you say was that once you leave Canada, if you have this RRSP account, you cannot get advice from your advisor in Canada. You can tell them what to do. They can be order takers, not trying to diminish their job, right? But they can be order takers in that side. Say, go buy this, go trade this, go do this. But if you said, hey, I want to retire in 10 years, how do I need to structure my investments to provide me a retirement income I can never outlive? They're not supposed to answer that question. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I
Wow.
mean, like probably the best way that an advisor could handle that is having some conversations and education, but then leaving it for the client to come back and tell them what they actually want to do.
Right. So you could talk in concept about things, but not saying which is, I know what you do, right? You working with your clients in Canada, you're not going to say, oh, great. Yeah, you should invest in things that go up in value and hopefully it'll work in retirement. You're like, no, great news. We're going to build a retirement plan, right? We're going to use guardrails. This is how your income's going to work. This is how we're going to do the investments. You're going to get in that nit and gritty with your clients to make sure that those questions are answered. Correct?
You got it.
Yeah,
You
but
got
that's
it.
the piece that we're going to miss then in that. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And now along those same lines of the limited advice that's available there is if you want to take this somewhere else, the institutions won't even open up new accounts. So you won't be able to transfer it into any other institution because they can't give
Holy
advice on it
moly.
anyway, so they won't take it. So the only option is to move it somewhere that you can open up a self-directed account where you're just going in and making up the trades on your own and picking your portfolio on your own.
Sure.
But in the research we've done, most of the institutions we talked to, like they wouldn't even open those accounts. So we did find one that would open it. And they also told us like you wouldn't be able to open it online. You'd have to call them directly and they would help you kind of bypass the like the address requirements to get the account set up. But
Exactly.
again,
Yeah.
they were reiterating the point that it has to be self-directed and they can't get
Wow.
like there's no advice on the account.
Well, see, that's kind of where this all started, right? I had a couple clients, and I've known again Joe for years. We were at a conference, and I was like, "Hey, I got these RRSP accounts. I don't want to take the money out. Would you help? You know, can I transfer these over to you and have you manage these accounts, right? Because the current guy's not doing anything. Here I am thinking he's a slacker because he's not doing anything, but he can't do anything with these accounts. He can't do that advice side of it.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, so we started chatting about that, and it is common. Like, I mean, that's why we're having this conversation because
Yeah,
two of our other advisor friends in the States have also approached me with the same thing.
yeah.
So it comes up, but there's not really a lot of options there. So
Hmm.
as you
Okay.
alluded to earlier, before you leave the country, it's ideal to, pick who you want to be with forever and set up a good portfolio.
So we're going to create advisor marriages is what this program is going to be, right? Is you really need to get in with that advisor for a lifetime before you leave the country to make sure they're going to be the good fit for you. So, and I think this answer is yes, because we were talking about it when we were kind of pre-gaming this, Joe, but please correct me if I'm wrong. If a client is working with you before leaving the country, this is what we're alluding to, and then leaves the country, you can still give them advice. You can still work with them. That's all good to go because you had that relationship while they were still in residency.
Yes and no. So that kind of comes back to what I
Okay.
was talking about before. So you can keep the account.
Okay.
And just to be clear, this would only be retirement accounts. Anything
Right.
that
Right.
is
Right. Right.
not in a retirement account could not stay with any Canadian institution. It would have to move out. So like not, I know we call it non-registered money or open money,
Okay.
right? So that would have to move out.
Non-qualified money. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, so we could keep that account. Obviously, to this point, we've probably already given advice and set up a portfolio in alignment with the plan and the goals and all that kind of stuff. But
Right.
once they are no longer a resident in Canada, that's when we're no longer able to solicit that advice, and we're more order takers, as you put it earlier.
Yeah, that's probably that distinction somewhere buried in some code, and we have the same thing on our SEC Securities and Exchange Commission, right? Our act was written in 1940s, so it doesn't quite encompass everything for today's laws or today's thought process on where people move. But there's probably something in there that says they have to be a resident in order to give advice. That's what I'm guessing, at least.
Yeah, it's like it's
based
a
on this.
licensing issue, is what it is. Because if they're not living, so I'm in Ontario, so
Right.
Ontario is a province within Canada, and if they're not living here, then I'm not able to give them advice if they're in Florida because I'm not licensed in Florida. Now that said, to
Gotcha.
hold an account, I do have an account, just like we're talking about.
Right.
Client lives in Florida, so I pay the licensing or whoever it is in Florida a fee each year to be able to hold that account, but still can't give advice on it.
Craziness. Okay. So yeah, just a different way. So this is really good to know, right? Because we have a lot of clients that are talking about in retirement, they want to move to other countries. They want to travel around. They want to do these things. And so one of the things that I'm talking about with them, Joe, and I know you do the same thing with your clients, is saying, okay, are we moving or are we having an extended vacation? These are
Right.
two different things, right? Are we maintaining our US residency and we're staying here and we're just traveling abroad for extended period of time? Or are we putting up residency in another country? Now the rules start to change.
Yeah, for sure. if you're coming back to Canada, for example, and you're already a Canadian citizen, and now you're going to be living here, that, as far as everything we just talked about, none of that matters anymore because
Doesn't
you're a
apply.
Canadian
Yeah.
resident. You can work with a Canadian advisor. You can have all your investments here and get advice on all those different accounts. So as far as that goes, you can kind of resume once you come back. Now, obviously, if you're going to a country where you're not a citizen, that's a little different.
Yep. Okay. Well, let's talk about that for just a second. Maybe we put the investments on a side burner. Let's just talk about some other considerations. I have several clients that are thinking about retiring, and maybe somewhere between 75 and 80, they want to move back to Canada because one of them is a Canadian citizen, so they want to move back. What does that look like, right? You spend a lot of decent amount of time in the States, and so we may have an ignorant point of view on what other things are out there. Don't laugh too much. I know you do. But what do you think? What are some things that we would be missing, or what are things that are going to be different about the U.S. versus Canada on that?
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely a lot of similarities, right? As you mentioned, I spent a lot of time in the U.S. So as far as your day to day, there's not really a whole lot different. But bigger considerations, specifically for what you're talking about later in retirement, is I mean, healthcare is going to be different, right? So that's going to be one consideration. So we talked a little bit about this before offline, but as far as getting like good healthcare, there's good healthcare here in Canada. It is covered as if you're a citizen resident, and so you get your like your card to pay for all your healthcare. So it's kind of like
Gotcha.
your insurance, your health insurance that you would have through your company or you pay for yourself, except that it's actually provided through the province.
Okay.
And but one of the downsides of that is wait times can be a big issue. So just because you need a procedure doesn't mean you're going to get it in a timely manner, right? Now, I mean, they try to prioritize, but something as simple as an MRI, you might be waiting a few months just to get in and to get something seen.
Wow.
Right. Now, again, I think they try to prioritize based on the scenario. Or we're looking at like a shoulder versus, cancer or something like that. But still, there's definitely some issues around wait times. There's also
prioritizing, not to pick on them, so to speak, right? But when I'm hurt, no one else's pain is real but my own. And I have this thing wrong with me, and I want an answer to the thing wrong with me. And I'm not trying to be rude about anybody else, right? But when we have that cancer scare, when we have those other things that might be out there, man, waiting 3 months to find out if it is cancer, isn't cancer, that could be a long 3 months.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even things like wait times in hospitals right now is pretty crazy. So we have one of the busiest emergency rooms in Canada. We're like my local hospital, and we're just a fairly small town with a pretty big region. And, you could be in there for 12 to 24 hours waiting just to get seen by a doctor at this point. And a lot of this is actually kind of a fallout of COVID. Like there's so many healthcare workers,
backlogs,
right, who just shortages because people have left because of the stress and the burnout through everything with COVID, and it hasn't recovered. And now it's like, it's going to be a process. I'm involved with the local hospital and just kind of talking to them. I think there's between 400 and 500 job openings right now at the hospital.
Wow.
And it's not a matter of like, finding people who are out there because they aren't there anymore. They've left the profession, or they've just given up on hospital healthcare and they're going to like public health, things that are more 9 to 5.
Yeah.
So it's created a lot of issues that way. As far as like long-term care homes or in-home care, that kind of stuff. It depends on your situation of whether that's covered or whether you're gonna have to pay for it. You can get private and end up paying a lot of money for something really nice if that's what you're looking for.
Now, what's a lot of money? So what's a relative cost on that?
Yeah, that's a good point. So if we say a lot of money, those is Canadian dollars, so maybe it's almost nothing, but we could be looking at upwards of like $10,000 a month, depending on what kind of care you're getting.
Okay.
Right. So it could be significant.
So that's somewhat in line with U.S. costs, right? It's going to be state or regional is going to go up and down, but $10,000, at least from Alaska, $10,000 a month in a long-term care home, it would be a deal. It's going to be more than that up here.
Yeah, so that would be like the high end, I would say. I mean, you could definitely, probably if you're in Toronto or Vancouver, find something a little more than that.
Sure.
And then you have kind of more the standard long-term care, I guess you could say, and you might be in the neighborhood of like, say, $3,000 a month to get a private room. But if you can't afford that, you will still get care. But what happens is you don't really get to pick where you end up. Mm-hmm. You also probably won't get a private room. Like there's no guarantees on anything you're going to get. You just basically get
Yeah.
wherever there's an opening, and then you're subsidized by the government for those spaces. But it's
Gotcha.
based on income. So as long as you have income coming in, like you won't get subsidized, right? But
Gotcha.
if you have no income coming in or under a certain threshold, then that's when they'll subsidize it. So you'll get that care one way or another. Just might not be where you want it.
Okay. So if you have income coming in, so kind of like what we have in the States, that would be like a Medicare patient. I'm sorry, Medicaid. Medicare happens at 65. Medicaid is kind of that poverty, is you'd have to be out of pocket paying for your long-term care unless you had long-term care insurance that would cover it. But health insurance doesn't cover long-term care at all in the States. And so you'd be an out-of-pocket expense. And once you blew all of your money and you were literally in poverty, every state's a little bit different, but like less than $15,000 in your bank, less than $10,000 in your bank account, you can still have your home, a lot of other restrictions, but any income that you'd have coming in a pension, that has to be assigned to the state in what we call a Miller REIT trust. So basically you have no money, and then the state would kick in and pay for it. So it sounds like some little
Some similarities there.
there.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So what I heard on the healthcare side is good healthcare, but you're gonna have a delay. You're gonna have a time issue that's going to be there. And so does that mean you got a budget for a secondary health insurance cost? What do you do? What do you recommend to clients?
Yeah, so I mean, so there's some things that wouldn't be covered, which you mentioned. Well, I guess this is offline. We talked about that. Like if you want some experimental, cancer treatments, or
Right.
so there's certain things that haven't made it onto like the provincial list of covered drugs or treatments. Now, so there's some other programs that you could apply for where they look at a deductible based on the income you do have, whether they'll cover some of it or how much of it they'll cover. So there's some other potential issues there. If there's something you need, you might not get it. But there are programs to help with that. Other considerations, I don't know, where were we just going with that? I feel like I lost my train of thought.
Oh, the secondary insurance, right? So you're gonna
Yeah,
have the state's insurance is primary, excuse me, the government insurance is primary, but then do you buy a secondary saying, hey, if I don't want to wait 90 days for an MRI, I guess I could try to fly to the States and do it. But what's another option if I wanted to stay in Canada?
Yeah, so there's not a whole lot of options there because the healthcare system's designed to be one tier, not multifaceted, right? So there are, there's actually, that's kind of a big debate in Canada right now because there's some kind of somewhat private clinics starting to pop up. And federal government is basically telling the provinces if they don't do something about that, they're going to kind of withhold the healthcare funding. So there's some gray lines of what is available from a private standpoint, but it's not widespread.
Gotcha.
It would be very expensive and in most cases not covered by any kind of insurance.
Gotcha.
So there's not really an option there. It's more just having the money to cover it. Or if you're a business owner, you could put it through your business, through healthcare spending accounts. But if you're retired, that's not going to be overly helpful. So there's not really a whole lot else you could do. There's some insurance, like I'm not sure if you guys have Best Doctors or not, but there's some Best Doctors insurance, which basically can get you medical second opinions from places like Cleveland Clinic, Harvard, different places like that. Doesn't necessarily, yeah. So I'm not sure if that's a Canadian thing or not, but anyway, so there's a little bit around that. It's not really a popular thing. Like there's not a whole lot of people talking about it or doing much with it, but there's a little bit of coverage and some maybe additional funding available through that. So those products are generally allocated or used by kind of higher net worth population.
Sure.
I wouldn't even say the mass affluent. So there's a few things, kind of fringe benefits to kind of look at, but they're not very mainstream.
So this is something good. I mean, regardless if you're thinking about Canada, if you're thinking about, moving somewhere else, it's the same conversations that we would both have with our clients, right? About saying, okay, if we're going to move someone for retirement, and that means more than likely we're going to need more medical care as we age, right? Just kind of makes sense on that side. Are you going to a place that's going to provide the level of care you want? That's kind of the question. And if the answer is yes, and they'll check all your boxes and you're fine with that, well then sweet. And then, let's have that conversation. If it goes to says, you know what, I'm really used to within the, a week being able to get my doctors done, treatments, except for specialists, those always do take longer, but I can move the needle a little bit sooner. Okay, maybe Canada's not the right option for you. Maybe we look at another country with options. Or do we just have a separate bank account of saying, okay, do you need to fly somewhere else to get these medical treatments, right? And it's not one is good or bad. I think it's knowing what it really is, and then how do you plan for that in retirement? Joe, do you think that's fair? Any pushback on that?
Yeah, I think the key there is planning ahead, right? Not saying, okay, I'm going to move to Canada, I'm going here, and showing up and realizing that everything's not going to be as available as you thought it might be or what you're used to. And And I think that's whether you're planning for finances or where you're going to live or healthcare. I mean, like all of that's the same, right? It's planning ahead is going to help you prepare and limit the number of surprises. So, I mean, I think everything you're saying, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, just with everything. And it's one of those things too, when I have of clients that come in, I don't know if you have this, but sometimes I'll have clients that'll come in and be like the 5 best places to retire to, right? Some
Yeah.
news article would write about that. And it says, I want to go here. I says, well, great. I'm really glad this news article has an opinion about this. Have you ever been there? Have you met anyone from there? Let's do a little due diligence before we kind of make this big move. I have a client that's moving to Japan in 2 months. And he's going to live the rest of his life in Japan. His wife is from Japan. And so he's going to move back over there. And we've gone through like the last 2 years kind of evaluating all these things. You know what? When you have to have a U.S. form signed because you're still a U.S. citizen, something will come up, renewing your passport, something else, and you need a notary and you're in Canada, how are you going to get it signed? Right? It's not impossible, but there's not notaries at the bank that can do U.S. notaries in Canada. Or Joe, am I incorrect about that? I'm assuming that they don't have that readily accessible in Canada.
Not to my knowledge, no.
Yep. So it's like little details like that, though, that really matter in retirement. It's the health insurance details. It's how am I going to get things signed? How am I going to move money back and forth? Where do you keep your money, right? Do you want to keep your money in the States? Do you want to move all of your money into Canada? What are the pros and cons? What banks will talk to each other? So Joe and you and I were just chatting about IRA accounts, right? I'm just RRSP accounts and then IRA accounts, right? Is kind of the Canadian equivalent in ours, but they don't play well together. They look really similar, but they don't play well. Well, what about bank accounts? How are those going to work, right? There's so many questions when we're thinking about moving overseas that we really need to spend some time and look at.
Yeah, yeah. And then, I mean, on top of all that, there's also currency risk. And what do you want to do with your currency? And if you move it all, like what if you come back? And there's a lot of risk there as well.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. Yeah, some other things that you've day-to-day life we've never thought about, right? We might think about currency when we're traveling abroad somewhere, but it's like a 2-second thought because you've already bought the tickets to go to Italy, and it doesn't really matter what the euro's doing. You're going anyways. That's different on like a 2-week trip than the next 20 years of your life. Could be a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. If we look back like 15 years, I think the Canadian US dollar were on par.
Yeah, so those are great things to think about, right? And say, how are you going to do that? Awesome. Joe, I loved having you on the podcast. I think this is great information, whether we're moving to Canada, whether we're going to live abroad, excuse me. I think these are good things to think about. This podcast is all about action items. So I'll do the first one, but I'm going to tag you in here. I'd love you to do an action item for our listeners too. But the first one I want to say is, you know what? Think about where do you want to live in retirement, whether it's a different state, whether it's a different city, whether it's a different country, whether you're going to travel abroad. But start thinking about these things now, and then we can start going through back, listening to this podcast. And every time we said Canada, just replace it wherever you're thinking about moving to. And what are the answers to those questions?
Yeah, so I think along those same lines, then I would say if you don't think you're going to live where you are today, then maybe start coming up with a list. So maybe your top 5 destinations of where you think you might want to spend retirement. And then you want to have a list of questions that you need for research. So, what does healthcare look like? What are the tax consequences? What's going to happen to my retirement accounts? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to piggyback on that one for your third action item that you can look at this week, which is what is your healthcare plan in retirement? Whether you're staying in the States, whether you're going abroad, right? Long-term care and healthcare, because these are different things. What is that plan? All of my clients have to have a long-term care plan. We got to have a discussion. We got to go through it. That doesn't mean they have to have long-term care insurance. That doesn't mean we got to set $500,000 aside for it, but we got to come up with a plan that says when, not if, when this happens, what are we going to do? And I think it's something really important to think about.
Absolutely. Oh,
Awesome.
That's great. I love it.
Joe, thank you again so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I like nerding out on these little details and kind of learning this.
You got it.
Fantastic. Go check Joe out. And until next time, happy planning.